Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Terrific. So my name is Winston C. Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies and philosophy by courtesy here at The Ohio State University. I am also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values. Through that work, I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS program. Many of you are aware of COMPAS. It is our ongoing program, which stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. What we attempt to do with our COMPAS program each year is select a theme and then organize a series of events around that theme, bringing together diverse disciplinary voices engaging with topics of sustained concern. This year's theme is COMPAS Directions, a decade of ethical exploration. And through that theme, we've been celebrating the fact that for over a decade now, we've been exploring these themes through the COMPAS program. And so we're taking stock, looking back at the themes that we've studied, recognizing the ways in which these themes are not historical artifacts, but are alive and dynamic, present with us in this moment. Back in 2016, the COMPAS program had a theme that really focused in on questions of inequality, and I'm pleased that today we're able to revisit that theme of inequality as we ask some very pressing questions about that subject. So without further ado, I'm going to call up my colleague and friend, Sahar Heydari Fard. Sahar is over in the philosophy department, working at the intersection of social political philosophy, ethics, calling upon social and behavioral sciences to make sense of change, social change in a dynamic and complex society. So Sahar will come up and introduce our guests at this time. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm so pleased to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces that I hope that I can get to know. It's my distinct honor to be able to introduce our amazing panelists today. Our first panelist is Professor Vivek Chibber. He's known for his work in sociology and social theory. He's a faculty member at the Sociology department at NYU, and the scope of his work goes beyond academic spaces, I want to emphasize. I am a big fan of his, one of his many, many books, The Class Matrix, and his contribution to Jacobian, who is very well known in many academic spaces and also activist spaces and community organizers. And I see that we have some of those amazing people here. Welcome. I learned recently that he's also working on a book on race in relationship with other concepts that he is known to work on. First and foremost, a critique of post-colonial theory, or at least making it more nuanced, not critiquing it altogether. No nuance, okay. And that in relationship to discussions about class struggles and capitalism, and in this network of amazing questions that he's inviting us to think about, identity politics, which is the reason that we have this panel, and we are hoping to learn more about his ideas about the relationship between identity politics and capitalism, class struggles, and so on. And the second amazing panelist we have is Professor Derrick Darby. He's known for his work on social justice and conversations about rights. He is a distinguished professor at philosophy department at Rutgers University, and his most famous book, I would say, is let me make sure. Race, I know it's 3R. Okay, rights, race, and recognition. I keep messing the order. But he also has a new book that I'm very excited about. It's called Boxed In, Making Identity Politics Safe for Democracy, that talks about the tensions that comes with identity politics in a democratic space and the things that we can learn from successful examples and things that we need to avoid. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Identity politics and what it can do for our political organizing. And the theme of our presentation or the panel today is income inequality. So the questions or the general theme that we're thinking about is the relationship between identity politics and income inequality. Are we for or against? What are the obstacles that we should think about? How should we even conceptualize what these identity groups are? So on and so forth. So without further ado, I want to invite you to join me in welcoming both of our panelists. And we're gonna start with Professor Chibber.
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you to the center for inviting me. What I'm going to do, we have 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, you can't really present an argument. So what I'm going to do is present as a series of assertions, a view that I'm developing, which I hope to be able to present to the world in about 1.5 years or 2 years, about what identity politics is and what its connection is to broader struggles and the desire we all have for social justice, in particular identity politics through the prism of race. The reason I want to present this argument to you is that, to my mind, discussions of race have taken a turn over the past 20 to 25 years that actually get in the way of racial justice. They get in the way of not only a more humane and just order with regard to race, but has turned race and politics of race into a kind of political view that cannot possibly win. It's become, I think, associated as a narrow sectional interest rather than what it was for decades and decades, which is the moral vanguard of a broader movement for social justice. Now, the way it's done it is that I think race politics has turned away from, for decades, its own foundation, what used to be its foundation. And this was the foundation that was propagated by the left, broadly understood, not just the socialist left, but by progressive liberals as well, which placed at the core of racial struggles the question of economic justice. And economic justice, not just for racial minorities, but the broader struggle for economic justice, which was taken to be the foundation for social justice, period. So the argument I want to make is that what we call identity politics today is often billed as the politics of fighting against racial oppression, but in fact it is not. What identity politics, the way we understand it today, is actually the worldview and the interests of the wealthier, more elite sections of minority groups, blacks, brown, and the same argument can be applied to gender as well, but I'm going to apply it primarily now to race. I want to argue that identity politics is actually addressing the question of race as experienced by and as advocated by wealthier groups within racial minorities. Because of that, the important point is it cannot in any way address the way racial oppression is experienced by the vast majority of black and brown people. And hence it stands in the way of racial justice. Now, in order to defend this view, you have to step back for a second, and we need a theory of what racial dominance is. And that will then motivate an argument for why broad-ranging economic redistribution is the foundation for racial justice, and that will enable us to see why it's rational and sensible for some groups within racial minorities to not have an interest in that kind of racial economic redistribution. So let me start with offering a definition of what racial and a social account of what the foundations of race dominance are. Racism is often conflated with racial dominance. And let me explain what that means. Racism is often taken to mean a state of affairs in which one group dominates another, the mechanism of the dominance being racial prejudice. So what drives racial dominance is attitudes amongst particular racial groups which demean, denigrate, and deny the humanity of a subordinate group. Now, that racism is such a view is indisputable. In other words, racism is associated with racial prejudice. But racial prejudice on its own cannot secure race dominance. And the reason for that is obvious. Unless it's backed by power, some sort of asymmetry in resources and power, institutionalized power, race prejudice can be symmetrical. So if one ethnicity or one race group demeans another, that the demeaned group can respond by denigrating the former group. Race prejudice becomes a mechanism for race dominance when it's backed by power, actual asymmetries of power. Now, these asymmetries can be of two kinds, institutional and economic. And by institutional, what I really mean is state-backed. So when you have state-backed prejudice, well, now my prejudice can be effectuated with real consequences for you if I have laws backing it. So for centuries, laws against Jews in various places. Jim Crow is the classic example. Colonial rule was racially, institutionally backed race dominance. It was one group having the power of the state behind it. Now, when race dominance is backed in this way, it's pretty easy to understand that the subordinate group as a whole has a certain cluster of homogeneous interests, regardless of their economic position, because they are politically, juridically barred from having access to goods, to freedoms, to rights. And the strategy for race liberation then is going to be to change that political structure, to change the political institutions. And there, you can have a kind of homogeneous race politics, as it were, to an appreciable degree. Though if there's time, I'll show you why even that's not true. In the absence of institutional state backing, how can one group impress its power over a subordinate group? Well, this is where my argument could become controversial, but I'm going to make it. The only available mechanism is economic. I do not believe there is a cultural foundation for race dominance. The cultural consequences are downstream of race dominance. They cannot create them. And I'll be happy to explain in question and answer why that's so. Now, in the United States, if we jump forward, the state-backed forms of race dominance have either been eliminated or substantially attenuated. If they exist, they're a minor part of the ensemble of institutions that generate race dominance. Primarily now, the mechanism is economic. Well, how does this economic mechanism work? It works by the dominant group, and let's just say that's Anglo-Americans, white Americans, having secured positions of power over key institutions, whether they're employment or whether they're institutions of promotion, housing, healthcare, education. In all these key institutions, you have one group that secured a position of dominance. In sociology, you call it resource hoarding. And that extends across classes. So in the labor market, white workers, either through unions or informally through their own networks, are able to secure privileged access to employment. In the corporate community, whites secure privileged access to employment and to promotion. In education, white neighborhoods, white housing, wealthier white families are able to secure access to better schools and to put up rules which then inhibit minorities from entering those rules. The shorthand expression for this is gatekeeping. So essentially, what happens in a situation where the state isn't backing the race dominance is that it can be secured if one group assumes the position of gatekeeper over key aspects and key institutions within that society. Now, that gatekeeping generates a situation of dependence for the subordinate group, for the racial minority. In very stark terms, they become dependent on the gatekeepers for getting access to the key goods in society. That dependence is the everyday experience of race dominance. the favorite empirical referent for race studies is disproportionality. Adolf Reed has written a great essay on the obsession with disproportionality in academia and race politics. But it's real. So it shows up that in no matter how you slice the social world, racial minorities, blacks in particular, but Latinos to an enormous extent as well, when you compare them to their peers in any slice of life, similarly educated, the people with similar skills, they always end up doing worse than their peers. That's because the peers have secured the decision-making power within that domain over who gets advanced, who doesn't, who gets a job, who doesn't, who gets housing, who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the empirical evidence for gatekeeping on the part of the dominant group. And it is, of course, absolutely real. And to the extent that it's real, the racial minority experiences its domination, in every sphere of life. And in that sense, is a community, is a racial community. Okay. Now, there are two ways in which this can be effectuated. One is if the racial minority, the dominated group, is internally homogeneous, if they're all workers, if they're all middle class, they are going to have a pretty straightforward set of interests with regard to changing that situation of gatekeeping on the part of the dominant group. They will have a similar strategy, a similar range of interests, and therefore a similar outlook, and their politics will be expressed, their race politics will be expressed by a set of encompassing demands that affect all of them more or less equally. The situation, however, changes when the group is internally heterogeneous. If it's internally heterogeneous, then, to the extent that some are wealthier than others among the racially subordinate group, to the extent that some are more well-off than others, have a higher position within the class ladder, they will experience the position of subordination in dramatically different ways. So whereas a black worker will experience his subordination through the inability to get a job, the inability to get an education, the inability to get housing, the black corporate executive or black academic or black cultural artist will experience it not so much as the inability to get access to these goods, but to the quality of those goods. So if you have a job, you get stuck at a certain level. You can move into a suburb, but you won't get the same housing that people of your income group get. You'll get slightly inferior housing. You'll go to a ritzy hospital, but you might experience a different quality of care than the ones that the wealthier, your compatriots amongst the white wealthy classes are getting. Now, if that's the case then, what you have is a situation where the group as a whole is subordinated, but the consequences of the subordination are dramatically different across the income divide. So that in turn means then that the way in which race dominance is conceptualized will be very different for the members of that group across the income divide. The wealthier groups will conceptualize race dominance through the prism of their own experience of it, which is the race dominance that today we see identity politics foregrounding. Not so much guaranteeing secure access to jobs, decent housing, decent health care, but the quality of those jobs, the chances for upward mobility within those jobs, the chances for getting housing that compares to the housing that white upper professionals or upper middle class people are getting. And of course, the everyday experience of cultural snubs, which are real, the everyday experience of the slights, of not being given the equal respect. So that means then that the program for racial emancipation, as it were, a political set of demands for racial emancipation are going to diverge. Racial emancipation for working class brown and black people is going to involve not just the disparities in the wages and the salaries, but the level of the salaries. Not just the disparities in the quality of housing, but access to housing altogether. Not just disparities in the quality of care, but the fact that they don't have health care. Whereas from the wealthier side, it's going to mean a focus on the cultural stubs, on the upward mobility, the blocked upward mobility, and that's why at the core of identity politics today is discrimination. Discrimination in particular against having the same rewards and the same avenues for upward mobility as their compatriots have within their stratum of whatever class they're occupying. Now, the point is, this is a dramatic departure from how race justice was conceptualized amongst progressives for close to a century. For close to a century, all the way up to, I would say, Bayard Rustin's Freedom Budget and Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, race justice had two components to it. One was a call for economic redistribution as being the center of race politics. And the second is to include race politics as a component of the broader demand for redistribution and economic rights. And hence, race politics had as its expression a kind of social democratic outlook. Today, that is not the case. Now, it's not the case because the social agent that had driven this view, which was black and brown working class people through unions, through political parties, no longer exists. So the political, to use a corny term, political hegemony, political leadership has been taken over by the quite substantial wealthier sections of these minorities. And who are we talking about? The professional classes within the black and the Latino population, and virtually all of the South Asians. Because the South Asians, by orders of magnitude, are the richest people in America, and many East Asians as well. They've created a fictional community called people of color. It doesn't really exist. It exists notionally in that there are some common experiences people of color have. They all experience some degree of vulnerability. It can come up in any second. During COVID, Asians became targeted in a way that they could have never imagined. It's real. Today, Palestinians are targeted in a way that they couldn't have anticipated 6 months ago. It's real. And of course, black and Hispanic people experience, regardless of class, some degree of cultural and social denigration. So it's real in that sense. But if you look at the political demands and political calls that are now coming out of identity politics, it's quite clear they overwhelmingly pertain to a narrow stratum within the non-white population, and that's the wealthier one. Is there a way out? To my mind, the way to actual justice along racial lines is pretty much along the lines that Bayard Rustin thought at the terminal end of the civil rights movement, which is it's going to come through a broad-ranging social democratic program, which does not erase race. This is a nonsensical thing that these identitarians have come up with, that if you have universal demands, you're somehow erasing race. It's nonsense. But it does understand that you cannot have race dominance without economic dominance. And you will not erase the economic dominance if a tiny section of the population insists on separating itself from the rest of the population in its search for justice. The only way out, then, is the way the left thought about it for decades, which is you put economic demands at the core, but not exclusively economic demands for justice, and you dive into the broader movement, because without the other ethnic and racial groups, you get nowhere. Because you are, let me remind you, a minority. And the wrong minority. If you were the wealthy, if you're the 1% who controls everything, cool. You can exclude everyone else. But if you're the voiceless, the powerless, you have to have a broad-ranging, multiracial, universalistic call for justice. And to the extent that that's true, identity politics is an obstacle. Thank you.
Good to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. So on the very bumpy plane ride in yesterday from Newark. I was reading a piece in the New York Times, and the headline of the piece read, "Americans are deeply divided for teaching gender identity in schools, even Democrats." So the philosopher in me said, what's that even Democrats mean? And so the presumption here is that all, or maybe most, Democrats unconditionally support teaching gender identity in schools. Now, what are we talking about? Well, the article basically said to teach gender identity is to teach something about how people's internal sense of their gender identity, they have a sense of their internal gender identity, and then there's a question about whether that sense aligns with their sex assigned at birth. So teaching gender identity is to teach something about that matter. So the presumption then is that all or most Democrats support teaching something about this matter. So the article drew on survey data, Pew survey data, but also interestingly a survey that came out of the University of Southern California that surveyed about 4,000 adults. And in the survey, it was noted that Democrats, by and large, support LGBTQ themed instruction. However, Democrats are split on addressing transgender issues for elementary school children. So it was observed that fewer than half of Democrats supported teaching elementary school students about gender identity or using transgender students' pronouns without asking parents' permission. And then it was noted that Republicans strongly oppose teaching about gender identity at all levels of education. So you can draw a number of observations from this data. I want to draw two in particular. One observation you might draw is that Democrats that don't support teaching gender identity in elementary school could be viewed as departing from a social script about what it is that Democrats should think or believe. Second observation, Republicans that actually support teaching gender identity in elementary school could be viewed as departing from a social script about what Republicans should think or believe. So Democrats, Republicans, partisan identities. But we have all kinds of identities we talk about. Gender identities, racial identities, religious identities, and then an identity that I think you guys will appreciate. When I got to my hotel yesterday, I could see the horseshoe. And so I took out my camera, of course, and I took a picture of the horseshoe. And I sent it to my youngest daughter, Tatiana. And she wrote back, "Traitor." Then I sent her the Michigan flag. She's a Michigan alum. So, Buckeyes and Wolverines, another example of identities. And those identities are associated with, if you're a Buckeye, you should think this way. You should hate Wolverines. Absolutely despise them, wish them ill, right? You should not associate with them, right? And you're going to be treated in certain ways by other Buckeyes if you do. So this idea that identities come with scripts or that or constitute scripts that give us guidance on how we should think, what we should feel, what we should believe, who we should associate with, how we should associate, and that have implications for how we're treated by others is a real thing. These are some of the elements that go into thinking about our various identities, whether we're talking about Democrats, Republicans, Buckeyes, Wolverines, blacks, whites, Jews, Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, whatever it is. So, two questions raised by this panel today. How should we understand social identities? Well, I have a colleague, Eduardo Martinez. We just finished a book called Boxed In, Making Identity Safe for Democracy. And in this book, we suggest that we think about collective identities as certain kinds of social scripts that emerge from certain practices that have to do with labels or meanings that we assign to the identity labels. What is it to be a Wolverine? What is it to be a Christian? What is it to be a Muslim? What is it to be a conservative? What is it to be a liberal? And so forth. They also have to do with the extent to which we might identify with these labels. I might be here in Columbus, but I got some love for Wolverines. And so maybe that identity as a Buckeye is not so salient for me. And that might account for why I can have some love for Wolverines, for example. And how we're treated by others. The labeling, the identification, and the treatment as are elements of these social identity scripts. Now, sometimes these scripts can be scripted too tightly. Like when the Democrat says, look, actually, I got a problem with teaching gender identity to elementary school kids. And another Democrat says, oh, wait a minute, what do you mean? That's an example of a script that's too tight. When scripts get too tight, we end up boxing ourselves in. We can box ourselves in and we can be boxed in by others. Hence the title of the book, Boxed In. This phenomenon that I think is a very common one, no matter what identity you're thinking about. I think it works really well with Buckeyes and Wolverines. You can probably think of great ways to flesh this out. Second question, what role should we expect collective identities to play in addressing inequality, broadly speaking? Well, I think one thing is very obvious. We should expect them to play a unifying and a dividing role, given the heterogeneity of these identities. They might unify us in some instances, and they might divide us in other instances. They can bring us together when the identity-like connections between us are strong. They can divide us when some of the connections maybe are not as strong as others. So what does this mean? Well, we got to figure out how to manage these identities so that they can aid rather than hinder us when we decide to pursue collective projects together as Buckeyes, as Republicans, as liberals, as leftists, and so forth. Right? Sometimes we want to do things together, like we want to cheer on our team. But let's say if our team is chanting homophobic chants in the stadium because one of the players on the other team is apparently gay, and we happen to be gay, and we wearing the Buckeye stuff. That's going to be a little problem for us. You can't go in for this homophobic chanting. Come on, it's just trying to do good for the team. That's a problem. That's a tension. That's an identity that's boxing us in, that's causing us a problem. So we got to figure out how to manage these identities in ways that allow us to come together for collective pursuits. Now, when we look at the phenomenon of boxing in, you got some theorists that say, look, so much the worse for identities. That's why we should get rid of them altogether. So these are identity skeptics. See, this shows you why you can't really do politics, because it's too damn divisive. The Republicans, the Democrats, the liberals, the conservatives, all they want to do is kill each other. They can't get nothing done. Buckeyes and Wolverines, same thing. They want to kill each other. They can't get nothing done. So let's just do away with identities. Maybe let's just think, we're just all Americans, for example. Maybe we could form one unifying identity. We're children of the earth. I mean, whatever it's going to be. We try to come up with some unifying identity. We're all human. Maybe that's the ticket. So they're the identity skeptics, and then they're the optimists that say, wait a minute, identities can be good. It's good to be a Buckeye. It's good to be a conservative. It's good to be an atheist. It's good to be a Quaker. And then you talk about all the good that can come from having an identity. It can bring us together. We can do Buckeye-like things. We can do Wolverine-like things. We can do Quaker-like things. We can do Marxist-like things. We can do conservative-like things together. Right? So you got the identity optimists that want to sort of keep identities. But then you got the qualified optimists. Martinez and I are qualified optimists. Yeah, they can do a lot of good things for us. It allows us to do things together. But we got to be mindful of the heterogeneity, the ways in which these scripts can be too tight for some of the members. And we got to figure out how to manage that. So the bottom line, we need to collaborate and work together to address inequality and other grand social challenges. Poverty, climate change, discrimination, war, you name it, just pick one. We need to make sure that our collective identities work for us and not against us. So to do this, we got to figure out how to manage them. We must know how they work. We must know that we can take charge of them, and we must take charge of them to combat an ethos of boxing in. So in our book that'll be out this summer, we try to give you all a practical framework for how to break free from tight scripts rather than propagate them. And we think this is imperative when you want to cooperate with diverse individuals and groups. If you don't want to cooperate, no big deal. But if you want to get something done together, then you got to pay attention. You got to figure out how to do it. So in November, Michelle and Barack Obama's production company released a film on civil rights organizer Bayard Rustin, who was mentioned in the previous talk. And so this movie came out in 2023, and Bayard Rustin was a civil rights activist and organizer. He was also gay. He was a Quaker. He was a leftist. And he, more than any other person, was responsible for the 1963 March on Washington that we most famously associate with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But it wouldn't have been a march without Bayard. Now, he viewed racial discrimination and economic inequality as grand challenges. And he believed that economic inequality required a broader coalition to address the challenges, a big coalition. Now, he also understood that all these identities in the mix result from people having different backgrounds, different perspectives, different forms of empowerment. You can talk about black people, but if you don't distinguish the experience of black women, you're missing a whole lot, for example. So he believed that all of these differences affected how we could address discrimination and inequalities challenges. And he was really aware of the way in which identities could be scripted too tightly. And I want to read just a passage, a little sampling of the book here, quote that really gives a sense of his awareness of this. So this is a quote, a partial quote. Feeling as though one must act in a certain way because one is black, so that's the black script, which is illustrative of being boxed in, can be an obstacle to collective action to achieve a shared goal, such as ending economic oppression. On some accounts of what it is to be black, says Rustin, one is supposed to think black, dress black, eat black, and buy black, and just plug in Wolverine or Buckeye or Christian or liberal or Muslim, whatever you want. And one is also supposed to associate exclusively with blacks, not whites, not Jews, especially when it comes to political struggle on behalf of the race. Again, make your substitutions. One complaint that Rustin had about more militant 1960-era black activists such as Stokely Carmichael or H. Rap Brown, to whom he attributes such views, is that by working with overly restrictive black identity scripts, they ignored black heterogeneity, especially along class lines. Rustin believed that this was counterproductive to building a broad political movement. to address economic problems in alliance with poor and working class whites, class-conscious white liberals, and labor union activists, among others. So Rustin faced a dilemma. The task of coordinating the collective pursuit of grand challenges in a manner that was attentive to intra and intergroup heterogeneity. And this was an enduring feature of his life as a political organizer. He recognized that identities were dynamic. We all face versions of this dilemma in our lives. I guarantee I could sit down and have a conversation with everybody in here over coffee, and I could find out all these kinds of dilemmas you come across that are similar to this thing. You're in this group, you see yourself in a certain way, you want to do this or that, but there's some tension because of the identity script's too tight. I know it happens, everybody in the room. Now, one thing you might do is insist on the correctness of our convictions. Yeah, but black people are supposed to do this. Jewish people are supposed to do this. Christians are supposed to do this. Muslims are supposed to do this. You can insist on the correctness of your convictions, but then the question is, now what? What do you do next? Should you continue to communicate and negotiate with people who depart from the script? Should you establish a narrow set of projects on which you can coordinate so that you can maintain some kind of group without having it fall apart completely? Should you pursue separate projects and split up altogether? So maybe what starts off as a group of 30 becomes like a group of 2, maybe. There's too many Buckeyes for that, right? You never beat the Wolverines if you guys just 10 of you, right? So you got to figure out how to make this thing work with your differences. So 3 main questions that this book is going to answer for you. How do we get boxed in by tightly scripted identities? You're going to want to know that. You're going to want to know what you need to do to break free. And you're also going to want to know how you break free. We're going to answer all 3 of those questions for you. And here are the 3 main lessons, my last word. We got to take heterogeneity seriously. There's no way around it. Second, we got to acknowledge our collective power to take control over tight scripts. We're not helpless. We can take control over them, but we need some accountability mechanisms. We're going to tell you what those look like. And then lastly, we got to embrace our civic responsibility to look for heterogeneity, to make it visible, and to act on it among our potential coalition partners so that we can break from this ethos of boxing one another in and pursue whatever common projects we happen to have, whether it be cheering on a football team, planning a community garden, organizing a war protest, fighting against teaching gender identity in your local elementary school, whatever it is. You got to worry about being boxed in and how to break free. I think that'll be enough for me.
So I want to start with this point that I found actually interesting in reading both of your work about your acknowledgement of heterogeneity of the groups, but the divergence of your conclusions, at least to some extent. That it seems like on one hand we have this a little bit more pessimistic view about identity politics, which I kind of translate into, well, there are different ways that people can connect to each other, but it seems like dynamics of production or maybe capitalism as like the base for that dynamic is playing a significantly more salient role. So the proper way of solving our collective action problems is to create groups that focus on that instead of focus on various aspects of our identities, right? And that would kind of break us down into groups that would not be helpful in generating meaningful change. And on the other hand, we have this also very good point that, well, like collective action requires glues that brings us together. And some of those glues are cultural or more soft or not dynamics of production kind of related things. So there's benefit into bringing people together over this kind of various axes, but perhaps building solidarity among those groups in ways that addresses inequality or addresses dynamics of power and money and so on. So I want to invite you both to help us see whether there's an actual disagreement between you two, while you're acknowledging the heterogeneity and diversity within groups, and also at some level the benefits of bringing people together and using cultural dynamics to give them the coherence they need or the unity they need to make collective action possible.
Thanks. So, yeah, I guess being a philosopher in me makes me want to reject the presumption of the question. This is a good trick for you. You know, somebody give you a question and you're like, I'm gonna reject that question. I'm gonna reject the presumption. And this also speaks to maybe part of maybe what might be a disagreement between us. The question suggests that there's a contrast between identity politics and talking about class. But I'm not so sure about that, because from some people's point of view, class talk is identity talk too. You know, I grew up in New York, and you definitely got some rich people there who got their own worldview about what to think, how to live, who to associate with. And it's very different from poor people. So if you say it's all a version of identity politics, sure, you can say that, look, you gotta be aware that there are like rich black people, there's rich Latino people, there's poor Latino people, there's rich Palestinians, there's poor Palestinians, et cetera, right? But it's not like we've gotten away from identity politics because we start talking about money, right? It's just like another form of it. So with that said, Martinez and I believe that it's like, look, identity politics, so to speak, and we don't use that term in our book actually, it's here to stay. It's just what we do. We kind of divide ourselves into different groups, Buckeyes, et cetera, Wolverines, rich people, Jewish people, Muslim people, whatever it is. People from the South, people from the North, people from the East, people from the Midwest, the heartland. I lived in Kansas, Texas, the heartland people, right? So we got different ways of dividing ourselves, and they come with different scripts. So that's the point. So I think our strategy is more pragmatic. Let's take this diversity seriously and figure out how to make headway with it, given that this is the hand that we have. This is what human beings actually do. They divide each other up in all kinds of ways, and then they figure out they want to go to the moon together, they want to put on a party, they want to organize a rally, they want to send food to the poor and disabled, they want to sort of bring religious education to the schools, you know, whatever it is. And then they figure out how to do it together with all these differences they have. So I'm not really prepared to say cultural identities are the bad things. Let's go for something that's not so bad and that's also truer to what the issue is, namely the class problem. And when we get to class, we're not really talking about identity anymore. I think we're still going to be talking about it, right? And so the question is, how do you manage this heterogeneity? So that's my first step.
I think we can keep that.
Oh, we can figure that one out.
2 microphone solution.
2 mic, I got it. All I need is 1 mic, though. Nas said that.
A lot of this just has to do with words. So let's be clear. We want to be clear on our concepts and not get confused with words. I think a lot of what Derrick is talking about is not identity politics. Oh, God damn it.
What you're saying
is not identity politics, it's social identities. And I'm going to make this convention, just make a distinction for the purposes of the conversation. So any human interaction is going to involve people adopting certain perceptions about others and certain ways of identifying themselves. We call that an identity. And he's absolutely right that there is not only is nothing wrong with that, it's inescapable. And so you have to learn to live with it. And I think the remedies that he's proposing are, absolutely, you'd have to be crazy not to endorse them. They're very sensible. What I was talking about was not social identities. It's situations in which social identities become associated with social domination. Now, those are two different sorts of things, connected, but two different sorts of things. And I chose to call the latter identity politics. So that means it is not necessarily true that identity politics will always be with us. Social identities will always be with us, but we hope to get to a situation where those identities don't become attached to forms of domination and subordination. Now, it is also true that class processes bring with them certain worldviews, and we call those worldviews identities. So he's absolutely right, again, that class politics is, in that sense, a form of identity politics insofar as people in the pursuit of their class interests have to mobilize others, create groups with common bonds, and a sense of mutual obligation, which is called mutual identification. And therefore, class politics will also have a kind of identity attached to it. So one distinction I would make then is between social identities and identity politics, and I think everybody would agree you want to transcend identity politics in the way I've defined it. And also agree that morally speaking, social identities are neutral. They can be good or bad, too encompassing, not encompassing enough, that's all true. So why do I then focus on class? This is where it becomes more controversial, and therefore actually an argument and not a truism. I focus on class because, to my mind, it's very hard to maintain relations of domination over time based on identity unless it's founded on economic deprivation. If it's not founded on economic deprivation, it's very hard to sustain because people who are on the receiving end of it have means at their disposal to either exit, get the hell out of Dodge, go somewhere where they're not being treated badly, or to overturn it. Not being able to exit, not being able to overturn it, my contention is the consequence of an economic disadvantage, being economically deprived and you lack the leverage to be able to attend to your subordination. Hence, identity politics is going to be overcome through some sort of common pursuit of economic redistribution. And that will also involve forging new identities, but now there'll be very specific identities. There'll be the identities of people who have a common interest in that redistribution. So now identity politics boils down to divergent interests. We've seen this play out in colonial situation, in race liberation, also in other kinds of politics. I don't think we disagree necessarily. I think we're talking at different levels of generality and at different slices of the identity universe. And therefore, I would follow Derrick in rejecting the assumption, the way the question is framed. I don't think it's a proper way to frame saying that identity politics will always be with us, because what's actually being said is social identities will always be with us, and of course that's true. Identity politics, however, God damn it. Identity politics. So clearly, somebody doesn't like what I'm saying. Anyway, you know what I'm going to say.
Okay, so I'm going to reject the rejection. So here's how I see the conceptual landscape, and please help me to see what I'm missing. What I'm seeing is that, well, on one hand, we have this claim that, like Vivek's claim, that if it wasn't because of class differences or the economic incentives or economic frictions, a lot of these kind of social identities would not be a proper base. Look, let me start from scratch. So if it wasn't because of those we wouldn't see the same kind of domination relation between different social groups, right? So the way that I understand identity politics is that, well, you are basing a social identity that brings people together as a base of your political action to solve some problem. And the problem that it seems like has a lot of salience for all of us is the economic inequality. And the question is whether or not this basing our collective action on our social identities is a good tactic to do that. So it is true that social identity is distinct from identity politics, but social identities are give us a platform or give us a way to make the collective action necessary to achieve our goal of overcoming economic inequality or other forms of inequality possible, right? Yes. But at the same time, these social identities are based on individuals who are very different in different aspects of their life. They might have different things in common or different things that are separate from each other. And there is a reason why they come together is because in some aspects of their life, they can create a unity or see the value of working together to achieve a goal. And that comes with some benefits. Well, some of the benefits is that if you have some rich people in your group, you can use their resources, their connections, their social influence, their money even, to mobilize and bring people together and use those resources to facilitate your collective action, to solve any problem you're thinking about. Let's focus now on income inequality or economic inequalities in whatever respect you're thinking about. So the way that I see things is that, well, like there are benefits in using social identities as a base to solve this collective action problem, shield people from the harshness of going against dominating forces, to be able to make change possible, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is people coming together and identifying mutually around a certain set of interests. Sure. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm defining my way out of a question, but that's not the way I defined identity politics. So again, one cannot be against groups forged around identities any more than one can be against solar winds or earthquakes. That's just a definitional part of what human interaction is. So I don't know if there's any sense in discussing whether or not mutual identification is a good or bad thing, or whether it will or will not happen. I think the way to sensibly talk about it is whether or not on given questions, like say the question of economic justice or economic redistribution, what are the odds that pursuing economic justice through forging a group along purely ethnic lines or racial lines in which there's economic heterogeneity, we can legitimately discuss, is it sensible or reasonable to pursue, say, race justice by bringing all brown people or black people together, regardless of income, if you believe race justice requires redistribution? The answer is no, it'll never happen. Never happen, and I know because it's been tried for 150 years and it's never worked. There's not a single instance, I've studied this deeply, there's not a single instance of an ethnicity that is internally economically heterogeneous or a race that's economically heterogeneous successfully pursuing an economic agenda where the elites put aside.
They really do.
This doesn't happen to you, Derrick, I'm just saying.
Gotta say true things.
There's no instance in which the wealthier have set their economic interests aside for the poorer of their brethren. I've actually spent a lifetime studying this. So, in the abstract, yeah, you have to bring people together around an identity, but you better be careful which people you're bringing together around that identity. So, I'm not rejecting what you're saying. I'm saying there's a sociological component to this, which is questions around identity have to be wary of which identities they're bringing people around, because there's also a question of interests. And identities and interests often clash, and when they do, interests tend to win out.
Derrick, do you want to say? Okay. So can I invite you to say more in some specific ways? So I'm thinking that like it is true that like I see the insight of what you're saying, that like you have a group of people that are coming together based on their racial, ethnic, religious, whatever identity, and they have some diversity in terms of their socioeconomic background or amount of wealth they have, the interest they have in change. And if their goal is to overcome income inequality, well, those who have a lot of power both have influence outside and influence inside because of the relationship of power that money brings in. That would like prevents them from actually achieving the goal that they're at least pretending that they want to achieve, right? But it is true that at the same time, when you bring people together, they generate like different cultures, different incentives, different form of social connection. And I think that is like a way of counteracting this dominance of economic relations as the main way that people are organizing themselves, right? So that cultivating that like social identity as a base that like gives my life meaning, gives me projects that I want to do or things that I want to achieve can change individuals and their incentives too. So it is true that we are living in a society in which a lot of our social satisfaction or even personal meaning comes from things that one way or another has to do with money, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Okay, so look, it's possible, but it's not probable. And there's a very real reason for this. Let's just be clear what we're talking about. You're absolutely right, Sahar, that if wealthier people are brought into a collective, their consciousness can change, then their self-identification can change, and they get pleasure out of working with other people. So it means that, in principle, individuals from a wealthier background, when they come into a group that's striving for economic change, in principle, they can be changed by it. The question is, how likely is it? It's important at this point to look at the historical record and not have this as an abstract discussion. The problem, first of all, abstractly, is that person will also be thinking in terms of what they stand to gain from the economic pursuits that the group is wedded to. The pursuits of that group are going to involve, for the wealthier person, higher taxation, fewer profits, more constraints on what they can do in their workplace, more constraints on what they can do with their money. And they have to weigh the moral pleasure and the social sustenance they're getting from the group against the actual losses that they'll have to undertake if the demands of the group are successful. And that's why the test case for this is the history of colonialism. And there was not one instance where landlords, the upper middle class, or employers as a group lined up in favor of economic demands that the poorer sections were making. Not once, ever, anytime. Now, individuals, Frederick Engels was a capitalist. Individuals can make sacrifices and be changed. But this is why social analysis is different from normative analysis. You don't inquire into the possibilities of individuals doing X, Y, or Z. You have to look into the probabilities. And as groups get larger and you deal with aggregates, interests have won out over these moral commitments that people have. That's
Lovely. Derrick, do you want to?
Make sure we have time for the audience. But I don't know. I'd want to hear more about the distinction between interests and identities. Because if you sort of have a sufficiently complex view of identity, part of what you might say is that what it means to be part of a certain X identity is to see yourself as having this or that interest, right? So in that way, interest talk could sort of make sense within the context of thinking about identities. But I guess the way you're framing things is interest on the one side, particularly economic interest, and then this identity moralistic kind of
I'm not
stuff on the other side.
I'm not a constructivist about economic interests. So I think they are out there and they can be exist independently of how you identify yourself. So that's a controversial view, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I think they do too. Yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah. That's why your mic keep going out.
Yes, I understand that. I understand that.
Okay, so I think it's about time to welcome questions. Please stand behind the microphone so those who are watching this from home also can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm interested in the idea of the historical background in here. I'm concerned that we may be comparing apples to oranges in here. And in my mind, I remember what is called the failure of the moral argument in the case of slavery, when a Southern aristocrat replied that there's no moral argument that you can give me about slavery that will make me basically give away my property and lose the value of the value of my land, right? Basically give away my fortune on moral grounds. I understand that. But isn't it the case that aren't the stakes less higher today? It's not like we're asking somebody, all right, you're freeing all your workers, now you're gonna have to pay them, and your land is not gonna be worth the same. So does that undercut a little bit the argument that historically there hasn't been an instance where people will just on solely moral grounds are going to take it as a class a tremendous financial hit?
No, I'm not even sure what you're referring to.
So I feel like I understand the idea of looking historically for examples, and you say there's none where the upper class just gave up just on moral grounds. They just, all right, we're going to take a financial hit on these grounds. And I quoted an example from a Southern slaver.
Yeah, no, I understood the words. I don't understand the intent.
But I don't see that the case is as strong today.
You mean, so because capitalists are not slavers, they would be willing to give up their profits?
Well, it seems that you can make a lot of arguments now that it's in their interest to...
So they're irrational?
I don't think... no, I think if you're rational, you can make the case that it's in their interest.
Let's take another example, again, on this. So look at the rise of the welfare state. Okay, the welfare state has come about in fairly rich countries after slavery. And do you know of a single instance of a welfare state in which employers as a class got behind redistribution? Well, the answer is no.
Maybe.
You have to have some empirical reference when we have these discussions, right? So abstractly, you're right. There are wealthy people who do, in some measures, in some dimensions, benefit from redistribution from a welfare state. Obviously, they think that there's something else going on. And I think it's a pretty heroic assumption we have to make then, that in country after country, culture after culture, case after case, they were not able to understand or appreciate the benefits and gains they would get from a welfare state, and they acted irrationally.
But the abolition of slavery in other countries, for like Britain or the Caribbean, where I'm from, I'm Puerto Rican.
In none of those instances did the slavers themselves say we want to give up slavery.
I'm not quite sure.
I'm 100% sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Walking there is a little bit. I'm lazy. I think it is both a question and also I'm trying to understand, Dr. Chibber. It's about your assumption. At one point, you said that there are homogeneous and heterogeneous groups, and homogeneous groups can have a common objective to reach, but it is hard among the heterogeneous group, or their interests may be different from each other, because homogeneous group, while trying to reach a job in heterogeneous group, the person might have a better job. So is there a level of importance or prioritization of these groups' objects? For example, can we say that, okay, hold on, first you have to get a job, and the second one, first you should wait the others get a job, because yours is a less important thing than the other. So my question is there a prioritization among the objectives? If yes, who will decide that? If, again, yes, how do we put them in a timeline, for example, in an activist perspective?
Sure. It's not, you are almost correct in how you understood me. I might not have expressed it exactly correctly.
Okay.
It's among wealthier and poorer people of a racial minority. It's not that the wealthier ones are ahead of the line in getting jobs or something. It's that they have different successes in the labor market when they try to get jobs. So wealthier ones, by definition, have access to jobs. That's why they have wealth, right? So what that means then is that among them and the poorer ones, they face different sorts of vulnerabilities. For the poorer ones, the real uncertainty is, can I get a job or not? I have long bouts of unemployment. I go long bouts without a wage, and therefore I also don't have health care. Therefore I also don't have housing and such things, right? For the wealthier ones, these concerns are less pressing because they have access to a job and everything that comes with a job. What they experience is less success in the job because of racial discrimination or because of culture, right? So what that generates is different interests. What you're under, I take you to be saying, are we telling the wealthier ones, you wait until the poorer ones get something that they want? And no, the answer, no. The moment you do that, you've lost their support.
Okay, then, can I ask another one? I mean, it reminds me that when the women movement during the left, during the, I don't know, sorry about my English again, but when people are trying to have their basic rights, when a group of women said that, okay, wait, we have problems as well, and I remember that someone said them, hey, we have more serious problems than your womanly struggles kind of thing. And I find it wrong.
Yeah, it is wrong.
Yeah, but
that's not what I said.
Okay, but then I'm trying to look at from the perspective that I understand that we have to do something to change perspectives, right? We have to do something for a better, for example, distribution of resources, right? But then we need to have a activity plan for that.
Yeah.
So where that plan will start, or who will organize that? If unions, for example, are just for the people who don't have jobs, then they will start from there, right? But also we have to better the people who have also jobs somewhere. So, I mean, I'm just a little bit confused from where we start our activism to get a better
you do whatever you
society.
can do. The point is, insofar as wealthier and poorer people within a group, whether it's women or racial minorities, insofar as they have different experiences and different interests,
Okay.
if the wealthier ones are not subject to any pressure or accountability from the poorer ones, the wealthier ones will pursue demands that leave a lot of the everyday experiences, the vulnerabilities and the forms of domination that the poorer ones face, they will leave them unaddressed. And I don't think that's a controversial,
Okay.
I think that's just obvious.
Okay, thank you.
That's with women and with minorities.
Okay, thank you.
Hello there. Thank you guys so much for coming. So something I really resonated with that you spoke about was that, and when I think about my matrix and my own personal identity, I have a lot of privileged identities, and in that way I have found that as a white man, a lot of the systems I have entered in, coming from a very poor background and involved in the system, were created in ways in which I was able to come out now in the university system and hopefully setting myself up for success. Where I get nervous, though, about creating this for all identities is that in my own queer identity, I struggle to see ways in which class is incorporated into it, and I just don't know if that's that I'm not appreciative of the ways in which queer identity is incorporated in class. But it seems to me that in environments in which I'm very aware of the threat to my queer identity or very conscious of it, it's rather towards violence or towards extremists, rather than about getting a job or access to healthcare.
I'm not sure what the
thoughts?
question is.
The question, I think, is do you think that queer interests are involved similarly to class, or do you think that's...
Yeah, there's a book coming out right now by Roger Lancaster, who's at UNC, on queerness in Mexico. He's an ethnographer, and he studied it in Mexico. And I can, from my experiences in India and also here, your economic position absolutely has a huge bearing on your freedom to express your sexuality. Because having a lot of money does give you avenues where you can either find pockets where you can do it, or move into cultures where you can do it, or a subculture within your culture where you can do it, which poor people just don't have access to. And the violence is absolutely true that the poor face way more violence around their sexuality than the rich do.
Do you similarly think then queer liberation should follow the same framework of centering less privileged and poor queer voices?
Always, of course.
I want to sort of just pause on that for 1 second. I'm a little hesitant on this one because, I mean, the suggestion that wealthy queer people have avenues of expression that poor people don't have in virtue of their wealth has to be squared with the thing that everybody appreciates in this room, namely the so-called democratization of expression that social media has given us. You know, you don't need to be rich to pull out your Instagram and your TikTok and express yourself. And in fact, arguably, the people who have been the most marginalized voices have been out ahead in terms of using that tool for expression, precisely because they don't have access to the Times and to the New Yorker and you know, or you know, whatever it is, right? So I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that? I mean, I think I'm disagreeing with this point.
No, I think it's true. So what access to media does is allows certain kinds of expressions, but they're verbal expressions. Expressing your sexuality, however, is going to be constrained when you're living in parts of the country or in neighborhoods where there's a very strong culture of masculinity, of heteronormativity, and you're going to have to deal with that because it's not just that you'll be treated badly or laughed at, you could lose your job, or you could not get access to a better job. It is the case that being poor sucks. And, you know, college campuses aren't the best place to bring this out, but if you're in a working class white neighborhood in America and you're gay, it's still going to be, you'll have access to TikTok, but you're going to have fewer avenues to exercise your sexuality than some rich dude who works on Wall Street. I just think that is obvious.
I don't know. I mean, if we come take your point seriously about recrimination that you might get in the workplace, I don't know. You show up at the wrong board meeting or the wrong, you know, luncheon, you know, and your queerness is...
There's no comparison.
You don't think?
Derrick, there's no comparison. Not today, not in this world, right now.
Really?
No.
Can I intervene first? Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. That was a lovely question. But like with your own logic, wouldn't it be the case that if you are wealthier, you have more to lose if you deviate from...
You also have more options. Of course. So in 1945 or 50, if you were gay at a professor at NYU or any other university, you couldn't come out. But we're talking about today's world. It's not an issue in many parts of the life of the professional class and the upper middle class, and even in the corporate world, it's toxic in many ways, but I mean, all of us know people who work in the corporate world.
I want to come back to this. I'm sorry, I can't give this up. Wait a minute. So wait a minute. Now, let's get another analogy on board. I mean, a very controversial one, no doubt. Okay, look, I'm imagining cases of white suits. In the white suit Wall Street world, you're queer. Now, there are all kinds of things that happen in that world. Like, a lot of it has to do with client relations, right? Who are our clients, and are they going to continue to be our clients if we deviate from their views about what's normative? Yeah. Now, the thing that's on all of our minds right now, obviously, is the uproar about the war in Gaza. And now think about how some of the elite universities are getting this pressure from very rich people who are not happy with the way things are going on campuses, and they're leaning on them and causing all kinds of changes. Now that's not the world I grew up in the projects. That's high society right there. We're talking about Harvard, we're talking about Columbia, that's high society world. And you have people who are not sort of part of the university, but who are connected with it through their financial power, who are exerting this pressure on these other people who presumably are autonomous entities at universities that can make decisions based on values like free speech, but they're not doing that. They're giving into this pressure. Right. This seems to me a good analogy of why I'm skeptical about your suggestion that you don't have this kind of pressure in the world of Wall Street that could basically cause problems for deviation from queer norms in that context.
Well, they are quite different.
Okay.
Let's start with
we're not going to give you another $1 million.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree. The point is, I think there's a reason why billionaires are losing their minds over Palestine, whereas the same billionaire class has not put up a similar resistance right now. If a person who has different sexual preferences than them expresses that preference in the corporate world. So there are very, very, very deep political and geopolitical interests wrapped up with Israel-Palestine, which a lot of these guys have networked connections with, whereas sexuality doesn't pose the same sorts of threats to them at an individual or at a group level, and they're less bent out of shape about it. Of course, you're right, that because they have money, they're going to be able to impress their preferences and interests on these elite universities.
Okay.
But you don't mess with American geopolitics without expressing a backlash, without expecting a backlash.
Okay, so geopolitics is also about who's pulling the strings, who's in control. So if you get control by, let's say, representing your opponents, your enemies, as, let's say, evil, and the evil in part has to do with their cultural depravity. And so we need to have power. You need to consolidate power around us because we're going to stamp out evil in the society. And the evil comes from people that want to teach transgender identity in elementary school. It comes to people who want to be openly queer. So if you go with us and give us the power, we'll get rid of those folks.
Right.
That's geopolitical. That certainly is geopolitical in the sense that it's about control, right? It's about power, and that power is obviously power that cuts across many different aspects of our life, both in society and globally. How we manage, how we negotiate the world in terms of narratives of who the good people are, who the bad people are.
Let me
I think we're straying a bit from.
Okay.
But let me just make a final point, because I don't know if we disagree there. The issue here is whether expressions of sexuality are given a wider berth and more freedom in the corporate world today than expressions of this kind. I think the answer has to be yes, yeah. So there's variation.
You got to see the study.
So we have two people on the line to ask questions. So let me intervene here, please.
So I agree, I think fundamentally about this idea of, economic advantage and that underlying the way that we think about structures of power and how we assert power. But, as we think about empirically the history of black wealth in the US, right, there's a lot of, I think, spatial and community components to it in the sense of historically black neighborhoods that accumulate wealth over time, and yes, they're destroyed by the state. But the way that you've articulated what you've talked about so far, it appears as though there's no sort of dynamic component of wealth accumulation when you think about wealth heterogeneity within a community or like within a specific identity culture. So I was curious about whether I was just missing something or whether that's like a fundamental assumption.
I took it as,
Yeah.
I stipulated that if and when there is wealth accumulation, here's the consequences you'll see, without giving any account as to where it comes from and whether it exists. Because, it's 15 minutes to give a big lecture. I wonder if are you asking, has there been wealth accumulation?
No, I mean, certainly there has been wealth accumulation, right? But if we think about, like, especially like black neighborhoods in the US, from 1900s to like 1960s, before we really had freeways destroying all of them, right? We had means of a liberation that existed just from facing inwards, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that feels somewhat contradictory with what you were articulating, which is that, we have wealthy people, and then once they gain wealth, they choose to protect their own interests. But in this case, they're protecting their community interests.
That's an empirical question. So there's not a lot, because the historiography of class politics within the black community is very thin, because there's this victim industry out there. But there's an appreciable, non-trivial body of work now that's showing that even in the 40s and 50s, and certainly in the 60s, the small but not insignificant layer of professional blacks and black businessmen did two things. And Rustin said this immediately, and King also said it. Once the formal voting rights were won through the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, the black middle class bolted. And there's a couple of very good books on Chicago and Milwaukee which show that in the struggle for affordable housing for blacks, one of the opponents was the black middle class. They wanted to move the hell out. They didn't want to stay there with them. Now, I'll grant you this. I think it's absolutely true that because the middle class was mostly forced to live with the black working class cheek to jowl, to your point, Sahar, it forced a kind of moral rectitude on them, a sense of obligation to poor blacks. It blows me away. If you read SNCC's history, in the founding meeting of SNCC, I'm sorry I'm taking a little bit of time, let me just say this. In the founding meeting of SNCC, when they formed themselves as an organization, there was a substantial socialist wing. You know what the most vocal section of that socialist wing, where it came from? Howard University. Can you imagine that happening today? Howard University has been the progenitor of the black elite. Why would these wealthier kids from Howard saying we're socialists? They came out of neighborhoods where even though they had cultural and some economic capital, they were interacting with black working class people every day. That's what's changed over the past 40 years. There's very good studies on this showing that 25%, about anywhere from a quarter to a third of the black middle class today lives in white majority suburbs. They moved out of those neighborhoods. That's had an effect on their consciousness.
Okay, thank you.
Well, with that, let's thank our speakers.